Okay, good morning, Rabbi Isai. We're on Daf Yomid Aleph. We're talking about the keva, which is one of the intestinal organs of the animal. They translate it as I think it's called the abomason. Yeah. It has different kinds of fat on it. And there is a machlokus between the rabbis of Eretz Yisrael and the rabbis of Bavel, whether we should rabbinically ban that fat. So that's what was being discussed over here. And we're up to the first line on Daf Yomid Aleph. The Gemara says, Da akashta kuli amalo pligi da aser ki pligi da ayatara. The machlokes between these chachamim of Eretz Yisrael and Bavel is regarding what side of the organ the fat is found. And it's important to know that the structure of the keva, the morphology of the keva, looks almost, the way the Gemara describes it, looks like a bow, as in a bow and arrow. And a bow has a curved side, which is the wood, and then it has the bow string, which is straight. So basically it's like a semicircle, is the way the Gemara is describing it, but in terms of a bow and a bowstring. And there's fat on the curved side, and there's fat on the straight side. So what the Gemara essentially says, that everyone agrees that on the curved side, what they call the bow side, everyone agrees that the fat is going to be usser, right? But kipligi da usser, everyone agrees that that's usser. Kipligi da ayatara, the machlokus is on the bowstring side or on the straight side. That's where the rabbis of Eretz Yisrael are lenient, and the rabbis of Bavel are machmir. Ika da amri da ayatara kuli amalo pligi da shari ki pligi de akashta. Others learn that on the bowstring side, that's where there's a machlokes. Everyone agrees rather on the bowstring side that the fat is permitted. The machlokes is on the curved side, on the bow side. That's where there's a machlokus between the Babylonians and the Palestinians. Kiha da Amar Rav Ivya Amar Rabbi Ami. Now, the first version of this machlokus lists it that there's a dispute about the fat on the bowstring side, whether that's permitted or prohibited. And Rav Ivya said in the name of Rabbi Ami, Mekamtsin. Rabbi Ami is an Amora from Eretz Yisrael. And because he's more lenient like the rabbis of Eretz Yisrael, he said that for the bowstring side of the organ, all you have to do is remove just a thin layer of fat because that's connected to forbidden fat. But the fat that is immediately attached to the keva is permitted. And that's what he means by mekamsin. Just take off the top layer and then the rest of the fat is permitted. V'chein Amar Rabbi Yanai mishum zaken echad mekamsin, and Rabbi Yanai said the same thing as well in the name of one of the elders of Eretz Yisrael, that's all you have to do. Amar Avivya hava ka'imna kameder Rebbe Ami kamtso v'havulei v'ochal. So Rav Ivya now testifies that not only did Rebbe Ami paskin this way, but he actually put it into practice as well. That once they brought out before him the keva, which was maybe, intestines are not things that we eat today. But in the times of the Gemara, we don't even eat we don't eat those that kishka. And even in the times of when they had real kishka, I don't think did they actually eat the wall of the kishka?
Yeah, the derma.
I grew up.
You ate the derma itself. Yeah.
Before they changed it.
Yeah, before they changed it to.
Okay.
Plastic.
All right. Great. But in any event, they brought him. They brought him this delicious-looking intestine. And they just peeled off the outer layer of the fat on the bowstring side, and he ate it. Now, Shamei de Rabbi Chanina havakoi kamei de Rabbi Chanina, Amarle kamotz havli de echol. So the servant of Rabbi Chanina, who was also an Eretz Yisrael Amora, he had an attending servant or an attending student, and he told his student, this keva, this intestine, I'd like to eat it.
It's the covering, right? Not the intestinal wall itself that we're talking about, right?
We're talking about the fat that is lining the outside of the organ, of the intestine.
Covering of the intestine.
It covers the intestine. Right. The fat covers the intestine. Okay, it's attached to the intestine itself. It's fat that's attached to the intestine.
What do they call that word?
Abomasum.
Abomasum. Is that fat, or is that another tissue that covers the intestine? There's fat on top of it.
The diagram that I saw is the abomasum is the name of the organ itself. It's an intestinal organ.
So it's one of the stomachs.
It's one of the stomachs of of a ruminant. Yeah.
Oh, I see. It encloses. It's enclosed. Inside it is enclosed.
On the other side of it, that sort of
I hear you.
insulates it from the other organs. They pack fat's packed in there. That's the fat
So
we're
there's
talking
fat
about.
that's attached to the wall of the outside wall of the intestine. So Rabbi Chanina told his servant, just peel off the outer surface of it, and I'd like to eat it with its fat. So Chazye dahava kamechases, or kamechasein, he noticed that his attendant was hesitating, meaning that he felt there's something wrong with doing that. So Amar lei bavlaat gum shadi. So Rabbi Chanina says, oh, I see you're a Babylonian, and you paskin that fat is usher, so it wouldn't be permitted for you to give it to me if you hold that it's treif. All right, so just cut off all the fat and throw it away. Tanya Reb Shimon Gamliel Omer. Now we have a new discussion from a brisa that quotes Reb Shimon Gamliel. B'nei me'ayin shenikvo v'leicha sosmasan kishera. He says that if you have an intestine that has been punctured through and through, normally that renders the animal a treifa, if there's a puncture. But if, let's say there's a liquidy material, some kind of vitreous material that covers the hole, then the animal is kosher. Now, my lecha, what is this material? So, Amar of Kahana, shirka deme'aya denafik agavduchka. It is a type of intestinal mucus that you can scrape off the inner wall of the intestine by using some force, and then you can actually observe it. Now, Gemiri chavraya de Rabbi Abba me Rabbi Abba umano Reb Zera v'amrila chavraya de Reb Zera me Reb Zera umano Rabbi Abba. That there's a machlokas as to who said what. Was it either Rabbi Zera's friend who is named Rabbi Abba, or is it Rabbi Abba's friend whose name is Rabbi Zera? And the quote is, "Berei de Reb Chia bar Abba hachi Amar Rabbi Yochanan." He says, so Reb Abba says, the son of Rabbi Chia bar Abba, who says in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, that halachik Reb Shimon Gamliel b'treifa, v'halachik Reb Shimon be'evel. That we paskin like Reb Shimon ben Gamliel when it comes to the laws of treifa, and we paskin like Reb Shimon when it comes to the laws of mourning. So what does this mean? Halachik Reb Shimon Gamliel b'treifa hada amra. That regard the law of treifa is what we just said, that if the mucus inside the intestine plugs up the puncture, then the animal is kosher. And Reb Shimon be'evel maihi. So what's the halacha like Reb Shimon when it comes to mourning? Ditnan kol shlosha yamim harishonim ba mimakom karov mona imahen mimakom rachok mona la'atzmo. There's a Mishnah that states in Moed Katan as follows. The Mishnah says, or the Tanya actually, it's a brisa, that if, let's say, there's a death in the family, and there's one member of the family who has not heard about the death, so the rest of the family has already started sitting Shiva. So the Brisa says, if it's within the first 3 days of the burial and the Shiva, and he discovers it within the first 3 days, so then it depends. If he lives nearby, which we define as within a 1-day journey, so then, as soon as he arrives to the Shiva house, he can continue counting using their counting. He doesn't have to start with day 1. If he gets there on day 3, it's the 3rd day of Shiva for him as well. But if he comes from a distant place, which means it's more than a 1-day journey, so then he has to start his own count so that he'll end Shiva later than the rest of the family. Mikan va'elach afilu ba mimakom karov mona la'atzma. But if he comes after the 3rd day, let's say he comes on day 4, so even if he comes from a nearby area that's just a 1-day journey, he still has to start the count separately and will end Shiva separately. But Reb Shimon Omer, afilu bayom hashvi'i ba'a mimakom karov mona imahen. And Reb Shimon disagrees, he's more lenient, and he says, no, if you come from a nearby area, then even if you come on day 7 of the Shiva, you count Shiva with the rest of the family, and that will be your last day of Shiva. So Omar, man dehu izki ve'esak ve'agamra lishmaita mipumei demara. So a certain student in the yeshiva said, and we don't remember who it is, says Rashi, if only one day I would have the zechus to go and learn this teaching from the mouth of its master directly, that would be great. In other words, he was bothered by the teaching that he had heard, and he said, I hope that one day I can go and hear it from the person who said it himself. So Kisalek Ashkechei Rabbi Abba Bered Reb Chia Bar Abba, and finally he had the opportunity. He went to Eretz Yisrael, and he met up with this Rabbi Abba, the son of Reb Chia Bar Abba, and Amar Lei, Amar Mar Halacha Reb Shimon Gamliel B'Treifa, question mark, and he said to him, you know, you're quoted in Bavel as having said that you can be lenient and allow the mucus lining to plug up the hole and the animal is kosher. Is that how you paskin like Reb Shimon Gamliel? So Amar Lei, Ha'ein Halacha Amri. So he said, no, I had said that the halacha is not like Reb Shimon Gamliel, and that we're machmir with the mucus plug. Now, Reb Shimon be'evel mai. So then this gentleman said to Rabbi Abba, he said, okay, so what do you paskin regarding what the second quote that was said in your name, that we paskin like Reb Shimon, that even if you come on day 7 from a local area, you can count with the rest of the family. So Amar Lei plugta ninu. De itmar Rav Chisda Amar halacha, v'chein Amar Rabbi Yochanan halacha, v'Rav Nachman Amar ein halacha. So he said it's a machlokes amoraim, and I'm not paskening. Some say that you can be mekel, and some like Rav Shimon, and some say you should be machmer like the Chachamim. And then the Gemara itself, the stomach of the Gemara, which means that the anonymous background author of the Gemara chimes in and says, Ve'ein halacha Reb Shimon Gamliel b'treifa, v'halacha Reb Shimon be'evel. And in the final psak, we do not paskin like Reb Shimon Gamliel to allow the mucus to plug up the hole and declare the animal kosher, but we do paskin like Reb Shimon that we can be lenient in the laws of avelus, so that even if he comes on the 7th day, he counts with the rest of the family. And why is that? The Amar Shmuel halacha kedivrei hamekel be'evel, because the halacha, and this is brought down in Moed Katan, that we always paskin, as a general rule, we always paskin like the more lenient position in Hilchas Avelus. This is not a very well-known principle, but it's important for you to know because it has very practical halachic applications. If there are 2 opinions in Hilchas Avelus, we generally say that you go according to the more lenient position. And that's true. Let's say 2 reputable rabbis come and tell you what you should do, and they contradict each other, which also always happens. So you're allowed to follow the more lenient position, and that's actually the appropriate thing to do, provided that you know that this is a reputable source that he's quoting. Okay? Amar Rav Shimi Bar Chia, Makifin bivnei me'ayim. So now we have a new sugya. Rav Shimi Bar Chia says that when it comes to intestines, if you want to do a post-mortem, and you're in doubt as to whether the perforation in question occurred before the animal was slaughtered, which would render it a treifa, or after the animal was slaughtered, which would mean the animal is kosher, all you need to do is take a similar intestine, take a similar organ, either from the same animal or a different animal, cut this or puncture the same kind of perforation in that other organ, and then compare the perforations. If they look the same, then you can rest assured that the animal is kosher because the perforation took place after shechita. But if the perforations look different, then you have to suspect that this perforation in the animal in question took place before shechita, and that's why it looks dissimilar to the perforation that you did post-mortem to this other organ. The Gemara now says, Hanahu b'nei me'ayim da'asu lekame derava, akfinu v'lo idamu. So they actually did this experiment in front of Rava, and they took a fresh organ to test the organ in question, and they did a perforation, and they didn't line up. In other words, they didn't look the same. So Asar Rav Misharshia Berei and Mimashmesh Buhu v'idamu. So Rav Misharshia, Rava's son, said, 1 second, father, before you're ready to paskin that this animal is treif, give me the second organ that you used as the test. And he started to press against the area of the perforation a little bit with his fingers. And then it got that bruised reddish look, and it looked exactly like the perforation that was on the original organ. And so he was showing his father that you can be lenient because now they look exactly the same. So Amar Le minolach ha. So Rava was astounded. He said, my son, how did you know this chachma? So Amar Le kama yadi mishamshu bahani mikmei delesi lekamei demar. He said, Father, it's just using logic. I assumed that, this organ that was brought to you with the shaila, whether it comes from a kosher or treif animal, I'm sure there were many butchers that must have handled this organ before it got to your desk. And so therefore, working under that assumption, I just did the same and handled with my fingers the perforation on the test organ, and look, they align and they look exactly the same. Amar le chachim beri b'treifos k'Reb Yochanan. So Rava was so proud of his son. He said, my son is as wise as Rabbi Yochanan in Hilchos Treifos, which is a big compliment because Rabbi Yochanan was a big bucky. Now, Rabbi Yochanan v'Reb Elazar da'amri teravayu makifin bereya. Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Elazar both said that you can do this kind of matching test not only with the intestines, but you can do it with the lung as well. Amar Rava lo amrin ela ba'osa aruga, avol me aruga la aruga lo. But Rava said that's only provided that it's the same part of the lung. The Gemara describes the lungs as having different rows, and I'm not sure exactly. Some translated as lobes, some translated as maybe the bronchioles. I'm not sure exactly, but it's from one row to another. Since the lung tissue changes, you can't make a comparison test with a different part of the lung, because otherwise you won't get an accurate match. The hilchasa afilu me aruga le aruga, and the halacha though, says the Gemara, that we do allow you, even if it's two different rows of the lung, you're allowed to compare the punctures. And midaka ledaka umigasa legasa, avalo migasa ledaka, avalo midaka legasa, provided that it's the same kind of something. And Rashi says initially that the words gasa and daka refer to the same kind of animal. It either has to be bovine to bovine or ovine to ovine. In other words, compare cows and cows and compare sheep and sheep. But you can't compare cow's lungs to sheep lungs and sheep lungs to cow's lungs. That's one way that Rashi understands this. But then Rashi's not happy with that pshat, and he says, no, that's obvious that you can't compare a large animal lung to a small animal's lung. But rather, the Gemara, when it says gasa and daka, is referring to different components of the liver, which are from not only different rows of the liver, but from different segments of the liver, because there's a larger segment of the liver, and which the Gemara had called before the uma and the una. There are two different parts of the liver. So those two different parts, one is smaller and one is larger. That's what is meant by dak and gasa. So while we do allow you to compare two different parts of the liver, they both have to either come...
The lungs, no?
I'm sorry, the lung. I'm sorry, I keep making that mistake. You're allowed to compare, you can only compare different rows from within the same either large section of the lung or the small section of the lung. Okay, now, Abaye v'Rava da'amri teravayu makifin bekana. Now, Abaye and Rava extend this halacha even further, and they say that you can do this match test with the trachea of the animal, the kana, the windpipe of the animal also, if you find a puncture there. Amar of Papa, lo amran ela ba'osa chulia, avol mechulia lechulia lo. But that's only true with the same ring of the kana, because the kana is divided up into three different sections, and you can only compare one section to its same section. And v'hilchas afilu mechulia lechulia, umibar chulia lebar chulia, avalo mechulia lebar chulia, avalo mibar chulia lechulia. And the conclusion of the Gemara is that you can even compare different sections of the kana to each other. You can take section 1 of one kana and compare it to section 2 or 3 of the other kana. That's fine. But what you're not allowed to do is to take different parts of the circumference. And just the way the diagram that I looked at explains it, is that when you're looking at a trachea, there is part of the circumference of the trachea has very thick tissue, and the other part of the circumference of the circle of the tube of the trachea has very thin tissue. So the thick tissue part is called chulia, and the thin tissue part is called bar chulia. You can't compare the thick tissue to the thin tissue, because even if the perforations look similar, that doesn't prove anything. You have to compare a perforation in the thick area to the thick area, or from the thin area to the thin area. Okay. Amar Ze'eri, Chal choyles shenikva keshera, Hol v'yireichayim ma'amidos osa. Now let's go to another organ, which is the rectum. And the rectum, if it has a puncture in it, it is kosher. Why? Because the hips of the animal support the organ so that it covers over the perforation, and therefore allows the animal not to die, basically. Now, vikama, how much do we say this? To what extent is the perforation allowed to be before we start saying that even that will be a treifa? Amar Rabbi Eloi, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, makam hadavek berubo, shelo b'makam hadavek b'mashu. So Rabbi Yochanan says as follows: if the rectum is perforated where it is attached to the hips, so then even as long as the majority of the rectum is not perforated, it's going to be kosher. So you could have a very big tear, a very big perforation, but as long as that perforation is attached to the hips, it's still kosher. But if the perforation is in a place that's of the rectum that's not attached to the hips, then even the smallest amount will render the animal treifa. Amrua Rabbanan Kamei Derava Mishmei Derav Nachman Amar Lav Mi Amina Lechu Lotit Lubei Buki Sriki. So they said, they quoted this statement of Rav Nachman in front of Rava. And he said, you guys got it wrong. How many times have I told you, do not attribute empty vessels to Rav Nachman? In other words, you're misquoting him, is essentially what he's saying. So Hachi Amar Rav Nachman, Makom Hadavek Afilu Nital Kulo Kasher, Vehu Shenishtayer Bo Kedei Tfisa. Because Rav Nachman was even more lenient than that. He held that even the smallest amount of rectal tissue that's attached to the hip allows the animal to be considered kosher. And so the Gemara now says, Vikama, how much is even a small amount of rectal tissue? So Amar Abaye Kimelo Batada Betura. He says, even if you only have a finger's width of rectal tissue remaining from a completely diseased and destroyed rectum, or injured or removed rectum, the animal will still be kosher, even if the animal is as large as an ox, even if it's a large bovine animal. Next, Hakeres HaPenimis. The Mishnah had made a statement, and it's important to go back to the Mishnah for just a second. The Mishnah had said, when we talk about different organs, we talk about the keres. Now, the keres is translated as the rumen. Okay, and it's one of these intestinal organs that exists in a ruminant animal. Obviously, the word rumen implies that it's one of the chambers where the food that it ingests gets processed, right, and gets broken down and digested. So the Mishnah had said that there's something called the keres hapinimis, and then there's something called the keres hachitzona, the inner rumen and the outer rumen. So the inner rumen will render the animal treifa if there's even just a small puncture. But the outer rumen will only render the animal treifa if there's a perforation, a slit, along the majority of the circumference of the organ. Okay? So that's the difference between the halacha of the inner rumen and the outer rumen. Now here we're going to see a problem, because the Gemara now is working under the assumption that they know which organ it is. And the problem is that there's only one rumen. There's no inner rumen and outer rumen. When you look at that organ, it's just one organ. So the Gemara is going to have this dilemma. So obviously when you say the inner and the outer, it's the inner portion of the rumen and the outer portion of the rumen. Well, which one is which? And how do you know where the line of demarcation? There's no dotted line when you open up the animal that says, with a diagram that says inner rumen and outer rumen. So how do you tell which one, what it is? So Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Rav Heyed Nasan Bar Shila Reish Tabachaya Ditzipori Lifnei Rebbe Mishum Reb Nasan Ezo he Keres HaPnimis Sanya Dibi. So you want to know what the definition of the inner rumen is? It's the part of the intestine of that organ that holds the Sanya Dibi. And Rashi explains that the Sanya Dibi is so much of the digested part of the food, it's been highly digested, to the point where it's considered to be excrement, it's really real waste material, so that even the wolves will not go near it. In other words, if you throw the carcass to the wolves, they won't touch this part of the rumen, because it contains really the excremental material. So So v'chein Amar Rabbi Yehoshua ben Korcha Sanya Dibi. He says the same thing. Rabbi Yishmael Amar Istomka de Karsa. He says it's called the Istomka of the rumen, and Rashi says, I don't know what that means. Now, Istomka sounds very much like the word stomach, but stomach is a very nondescript word. So Rashi's, I'm not sure. What?
With a Q.
Okay, with a Q.
With a Q. Q-U-E.
Okay, all right. Well,
Old French.
okay. So he says, I don't know what that is. Ravasi Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Makom Tsar Yesh Bekeres Ve'ini Yodeya Ezehu. Now Rav Asi quotes Rabbi Yochanan as saying it's where there's a narrowing of the rumen, it tapers and narrows. That's what's called the keres hapnimi, but I don't know exactly where that starts and where it ends. So Amar Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak Nafal Karsa Bebira. He says, well, if that's the case, then the keres has fallen into the big hole, because basically you haven't helped us at all. We got to throw the whole thing away based on your testimony because you haven't really defined which one is which. Amar Rav Acha bar Rav Ava, Amar Rabbi Asi, min hameitzar ulamata. He says, no, there's a very distinct area where it begins to taper, and that's facing the veshet, which is the esophagus. So as the organ gets closer to the esophagus, it begins to taper. So as soon as it begins to taper, that's the keres hapinimi, and therefore even a small puncture will render it a treifa, but beyond that, it's not a problem. Rabbi Yaakov bar Nachmeni Omar Shmuel Makom She'ein Bo Miles. He describes it as far as the surface tissue of the organ will be able to tell you whether it's the inner or the outer, because the inner is completely smooth and doesn't have any granular tissue protruding from it, whereas the rest of the rumen has some kind of granulation in the tissue, and therefore it's rough when you touch it. Rabbi Avina Omar Geniva Mishmei Derav Tefach beveshet samach lekeres zuhi keres apinimis. So Rabbi Avina says in the name of Geniva, in the name of Rav, that if you just measure off one tefach off from the esophagus and you look at that tissue, that's called the keres apinimi. In other words, he actually uses a measurement to be able to tell you what it is, which of course is problematic because it would l'chora depend on the size of the animal, but maybe it's just for an average size animal. Anyway, Amri b'ma'arav mishmei de Rabbi Yossi bar Chanina kol hakeres kulo zohi keres hapinimis ve'izehu keres hachitzon basar hachofa esrov hakeres. And he seems, in the name of Rabbi Asi in Eretz Yisrael, in the name of Rabbi Yossi bar Chanina in Eretz Yisrael, they seem to be having a much more machmir shita. They say, no, the entire rumen is called the keres hapinimi. You know what was meant by the outer rumen? Not the rumen itself, but there's a layer of tissue that is attached to the rumen, and that's what they mean by the outer rumen. Okay? Now, Rabba bar Rav Huna Amar mifar asa, or mipar asa. My mipar asa, Amar Rav Ivya hecha de pari tabachi. So he says that it refers to the par asa. The Gemara says, what is from the par asa? And the Gemara answers, it's where the butchers tend to slit open the animal when they want to pull out all of the internal organs. They will make a slit in the stomach to open up the animal, and they will pull out all of the organs. So the rumen, when you slit open the stomach, the rumen is what you're looking at. So that part that faces you when you slit open the stomach, that's the keres hapnimi, and everything behind it is the outer keres.
You slit open the abdominal wall, you mean?
Yes.
Not the organ, it's not the abdominal wall.
Correct. I'm sorry. You slit open the belly. Yeah. I'm using layman's terms. Yeah. Okay. Ben Naharda Avdi Karaba bar Rav Huna. So in Naharda, they paskined like Rabba bar Rav Huna to define, as he said, wherever they slit open the belly, that's where you'll find the inner rumen, and everything behind it is the outer rumen. That's how they paskined. Amarle Rav Ashi la Amemar kol hani shmait samai. So Rav Ashi said to Amemar, well, what about all of those other interpretations or explanations as far as delineating between the inner and the outer rumen? So Amarle kulhu shayachan b'derabba bar Rav Huna. So he said, there's no inconsistency because really Rabbi Bar Rav Huna's definition lines up with all of the other definitions that we've seen. Because when you think about it, he's basically telling you it's the place where you encounter when you first slit open the belly, which is also the place where it tapers, which is also a tefach, closest to the esophagus and so forth and so on. In other words, it's all consistent. So, Uda Rav Asi Amar Rabbi Yochanan Mai, Amar Lei, Kvar Pirsha Rav Acha Bar Ava. So he says, and according to Rav Asi, who had said in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, he said, there's a tapering of the rumen, and I don't know where it is. Is that consistent? So he said yes, because Rav Acha Bar Ava had said that it's from Min HaMeitzer or Lamata, from a place called the Meitzer, where it starts to taper. And that's exactly the place that you encounter when you slit open the belly. And Ud Rebbe Avinu de Bnei Ma'arav Amai, Amar Lei, Hani Vadai Pliga. What are you going to do about Rebbe Avina and the rabbis of Eretz Yisrael who consider the entire rumen to be the inner rumen? He said that for sure is a machlokes, and that cannot line up with Rabbi Bar Avuna. In other words, yes, you're right, that opinion is more machmir, but we don't have to be machmir like that opinion because we can follow all of the other Amoraim who are lined up in unison. Okay, let us go weiter. Rabbi Yehuda Omer Bigedola. So what did the Mishnah had made a statement which is a little bit ambiguous. The Mishnah had said that there are two organs, which we're going to see now. They are the Hagedola Tefach v'Haketana Beruba. Now, the large. We're still talking about the rumen, but Rabbi Yehuda said that if it's from a large animal, so then there has to be a perforation or a slit of one tefach, a tear of one tefach for the animal to be a treifa. But if it's a small animal, it has to be in the majority, the tear has to be in the majority. That's one way of understanding it. But it could also mean that he's talking about Gedol and Ketana, could be talking about the organ itself. If it's a large organ, then it has to be slit one tefach. If it's a small rumen, then it has to be slit in the majority. So the Gemara is going to clarify what he means. So Amar Rav Binyamin Bar Yefes, Amar Rav Elazar, Lo Gedola Gedola Mamish, Velo Ketana Ketana Mamish, Ela Kol Shenikra Ba Tefach, Velo Havi Ruba, Zuhi Sheshaninu Begedola Tefach, Ruba. Zuhi Sheshaninu Begedola Tefach. Ruba Velo Havi Tefach, Zuhi Sheshaninu Beketana Beruba. Period. So Rabbi Binyamin Bar Yefes clarifies what Rabbi Yehuda means. He's not talking about large and small animals. He's talking about large and small rumens. And he says it's a very subjective large and small. What does that mean? It basically means as follows, that if it would be torn a tefach and it would still not be torn in the majority of the circumference, that's defined as a small rumen, and that's a large rumen. And if it's torn a tefach, even if it's not the majority because it's a much larger organ, the animal will still be a treifa. If, however, it's a smaller rumen and it's perforated along the majority of the circumference, then even if that majority is less than a tefach, that animal will also be a treifa. So the Gemara says, Ruba v'lo havi tefach pshita. So the Gemara says, listen, the rumen is a vital organ. Obviously, if it's the majority of it is perforated, it's going to be a treifa. Why does Rabbi Yehuda need to tell me that if that's such an obvious point? So the Gemara says, Lo tzricha dahavya tefach b'mashu. Mahu detema ademikra ba tefach lo havi treifa, kamash malan. So the answer is that when it's just exactly slightly less than 2 tfachim, the entire circumference of the rumen. If it's slightly less than 2 tfachim, and what happens is that you perforate it just under a tefach, so you've got a majority of a perforation, but it's just a very, very barely thin majority. So the Gemara, what Rabbi Yehuda is teaching me is that you might think that since it's close enough to 2 tfachim that you would need a full 2 tfachim, a full tefach to be torn in order to define it as perforated. So the Gemara says kamash malan, that you don't need a full tefach. As long as it's a majority is perforated, then it's still going to be a treifa. Now, Amar Geniva, Amar Rabbi Asi, Niktara Kisela Treifa, She'im Timtach Tamur Ala Tefach. Now, Geniva says an interesting halacha. He says, up until now, we've been talking about a tear in the tissue. What if there's not a tear in the tissue, but there's a puncture hole that's the size of an Isar coin? So, an Isar coin, if it's the size of a Sela coin, if it's the size of a Sela, so then that's a sign that the animal is treifa, because even though it's not perforated along the majority, but if you were to stretch that tissue to make it into a slit instead of a round circle, it would come out to be the size of a tefach, and therefore would be a sign of a treifa. Amar Reb Chia bar Abba l'didim mefarshel minei de geniva amabora de naharda kisela kishera yeser mi kisela tereifa. That Reb Chia bar Abba says, no, I have to correct you. That when I was speaking to Geniva, he explained to me on the bridge crossing of the river crossing of Naharda, that if it's exactly the size of a Sela coin, then it's still kosher. It's got to be larger than a Sela coin in order for it to be a treifa. The kama yeser mikasela, and how much is that larger? The whole size has to be larger than a Sela. How much larger than a Sela does it have to be? Amar Rav Yosef kagon da'aylan tlas kashyasa b'tzipa b'duchka below tzipa b'revacha. The Gemara gives a very unusual way of measuring it. It says, take 3 date pits. If you strip off all of the date fruit from the pits, and the 3 pits, holding them bunching them together, can fit through easily through the hole, then that's a sign that it's a treifa, and it's larger than a Sela coin. If the date pits still have a little bit of date fruit on them, like there's still a little bit of stuff still attached, then they'll be a little bit larger, but if you can still squeeze them through by pushing them, that's also a sign that the hole is big enough to render the animal a treifa. Now let's go on, we'll just take another couple of minutes. Hameses, what?
And date pits are consistent no matter what?
Well, that's also a good question. I'm not sure. They must have known about date pits in Naharda, but because this whole discussion is happening in Naharda, so there must have been some standard date trees in Naharda.
By the river crossing. It's so
by the river crossing, yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah.
It's not by the river.
Down by the riverside. Anyway, so if we go back to the Mishnah had then listed 2 other organs that if they are punctured through and through, then it renders the animal treifa. But it has to be nikvu lachutz, in other words, from the inside to the outside. The 2 organs are the meses and the beis hakosos. So the meses, how do they translate it as? The omesim. And the beis hakosos is the reticulum. Okay, so those are 2 other intestinal organs. Again, I don't find the tremendous value by translating them, but I guess that's by looking at the diagram you can identify them. So those things, they have to be punctured through and through in order to be a treifa. Tanu Rabbanan machat shenimtza ba'ove beis hakosos mitzad echad keshera mishnei tzdadim treifa. So the Brisa tells us that if you, after you shech the animal, you find a needle embedded in the tissue of either of these 2 organs, here we're talking about the beis hakosos, the reticulum, so if it's only punctured on one side but doesn't go through to the other side, it's kosher. But if it goes through and through from one side to the other, you see the needle on both sides, so then it's a treifa. Nimtza alea koret dam biyadua shelifnei shchita. Lo nimtza alea koret dam biyadua shelachar shchita. But then the Brisa qualifies it further. Even if you see the needle go through, you have to see a drop of blood congealed and attached to the needle in order to verify that the needle was inserted before the shchita. It's only when the blood is still circulating, when the animal is alive, that the needle will render the animal a treifa. But in that case, because the animal is still alive, there will be blood that attaches to the needle. But it's also possible that the needle was punctured after the animal was shechted, and one of the butchers was handling it, and there was a needle in the vicinity, and it got stuck into the tissue, and that would not render the animal treifa because it happened after it was shechted. Now, higlid piyamaka biyadua sheshlosha yamim koidem shchita. Lo higlid piyamaka hamotze mechavero olav haraya. So the Gemara now says something else. The Brisa says, now let's talk about when you know for sure that the animal was a treifa, because the needle went through and there was blood attached to the needle, but now you want to know how many days before the shechita did the perforation take place. Now, what difference does that make? The answer is, it's a choshen mishpat shaila, it's a dinei mamanis, it's monetary. Because let's say I bought the animal from a merchant, and I told him I need a kosher animal. He says, all my animals are kosher, you have nothing to worry about. Well, I bought it from him 2 days ago. I do a post-mortem, we open up and look at the intestine, and we see that not only is there a needle with blood attached to it, but there is a scab tissue, scar tissue that has begun to form all around where the needle is. That's a sign that this perforation took place more than 3 days ago. In which case, I have a right to go back to the merchant and tell him, here's the evidence that you sold me a treifa animal. But if there's no scar tissue that starts to form around the needle, then I can't prove that the needle occurred either before the guy sold it to me, in which case I can't sue him, because he could always say to me, well, maybe it swallowed a needle after you took it home, in which case I sold you a kosher animal and it's your problem. So the Gemara now says, so the question then is asked, why is it that over here, the only time we declare the needle a sign of a treifa is if there's blood attached to the needle? Why is it that with all other cases, anytime there's a perforation in the vital organ, it's rendered treifa, and we don't vacillate as to whether it occurred before the shechita or after the shechita? And here you're willing to be lenient and say, well, if there's no blood, you can assume that it happened after the shechita. So the Gemara answers, Hasam leka midi lemisrach, hacha keven deika machad isa de koidem shechita hu misrach havesarich. And the Gemara answers, and with this we'll finish, is that when there's no foreign object, all you find is a puncture, a perforation, so then you have no way of knowing whether it happened before shechita or after, and therefore you have to be machmer and assume that it happened before the shechita. But over here there's forensic evidence. When a foreign object punctures an organ, there's always going to be blood that attaches itself to the foreign object. And therefore, if you find that blood, that's a sign that the animal was still alive when that perforation took place. But if there's no blood, then that's a sign that it happened after the animal was already dead and there was no more circulation of blood. And that's the reason, because of the foreign object of the needle, which is why you can make that distinction. In all other cases, you don't. Have a wonderful day.